really get a good handle on Discworld Noir, you should understand both facets of the title. We've spent, and I imagine will continue to spend, a lot of real estate in the thread talking about Terry Pratchett's Discworld, its settings, history, geography, themes, characters, what we like and don't like, our favorite stories, how we have concerns about the ongoing narrative structure of the series, etc., etc., etc. So now let's take a moment and investigate the other facet, noir, specifically film noir. One of my favorite things about doing LPs is that I always end up learning something interesting or surprising when digging through source material, and this was certainly the case when it came to film noir. And even before I started investigating, I knew it was one of my favorite genres, but as it turns out, as I dig more into the history and themes associated with it, I like it for reasons I didn't even fully understand. I think I was just subconsciously enjoying large parts of this. So let's really dig into it and see what we can find. I had the privilege of talking to a professor of film and film noir historian, so that's going to inform a lot of the discussion that I have about this. In addition, I just did a little basic internet detectiving, so if you think you spot something from Wikipedia, well, that's probably true. Anyway, when I used to think of film noir, and I imagine when many of you think of it, what's really coming to mind is the hard-boiled detective genre. Hallmarks of this include alienated, obsessed, anti-hero tough guys, glamorous femme fatales that betray them, urban settings and locations, typically marginalized. If they are rich and posh, it's as a stark contrast to the poverty of other places. Investigations into the dark side of the American dream, a down-and-out economy, racism, sexism, post-war traumas, cultural demoralization, etc., etc., etc. This is more or less exactly what I pictured, and I think a good way to think about this is if you've played the game Max Payne 2. I've actually not played Max Payne 1, so this could be a good example too, but Max Payne 2, at least, is a really good example of this. I tended to think of film noir as essentially the action levels from Max Payne 2. You're a detective, you wear a trench coat, it's probably raining, you navigate decaying urban environments, taking down thugs, or, maybe just wisecracking or punching your way past them if it's not a run-and-gun video game, in the service of solving some murder, or finding someone who's missing, or solving some crime-related thing. Now, that's all well and good. I mean, it certainly makes for some interesting cinema, but let's be honest here, there's only so many times that that's interesting. Will the wisecracking detective solve the mystery? Oh, yep, he did. Okay, film over. No, just like with zombie films, when the genre proves itself to be resilient and culturally relevant decade after decade, you've got to think there's something else going on here. And the first clue to me that there was something else going on was when I tried to look up a definition of film noir. It turns out there isn't even a set one. Film critics and historians can't really agree on a firm definition of what makes it a genre, or if it even is one. Some people suggest it's closer to something like screwball comedy, meaning it can incorporate almost any kind of story and setting as long as it keeps a few elements. The film historian that I spoke to said that instead of a genre, she preferred to think of it as a mode, which is sort of a meta-genre, a super-genre capable of informing all other genres. So you could have a film noir western, or a film noir musical, or something like that. And that was really interesting to me because I had really thought of it just like a western. I mean, if you think about westerns, they sort of have to take place in the American West, usually in 1800s, or I guess early 1900s, and they involve themes of cattle rustling and betrayal and, hidden treasure and things like that. The point is they're localized to a particular place and a particular kind of protagonist. But when you start digging into things that are considered noir, sure, many of them are 1920s through 50s big city private investigators solving crimes and navigating their ways through urban intrigue. But that's actually more an artifact of the fact that pulp detective, hard-boiled detective stories were very popular at the time that film noir started coming out. In actual fact, while there isn't a firm definition, there are a number of elements that most film critics and reviewers agree make something film noir, or there are certainly elements that you can look for to clue you in. It is one of those things where you sort of know it if you see it, but these elements are frequently present. One, it involves an alienated hero of some kind. It doesn't have to be a detective, but notice that the heroes in these things are very rarely a police officer who has the full force of the law behind him as in the good graces of his superiors. If it is a police officer, it's a loose cannon. More frequently than that, it's a private investigator. It can be civilians. The point is it's someone who is not invested with power in the current system. He is disenfranchised in some way. The forces he is arrayed against tend to be both literal, there is an objective realism element, and figurative or symbolic. There's a highly subjective expressionism depicting inner reality. A really good example of this would be the dreamlike stages in Max Payne 2, in which you're sort of almost fighting against the storyline of the game itself. You're haunted by demons, you're pill-addled sometimes, and you have these nightmares that you have to progress through. There's an intense amount of symbolism all around you, and even the suggestion that a lot of the struggles you go through are just reflections of your inner demons. Related to that, there are a number of elements that I'm kind of grouping together into what I might call confused storytelling. There's oniric elements, or elements that are dreamlike. You're not really sure if they're real, or if they're dreams, or if they're metaphors, or if the character is hallucinating or kind of going crazy, or what. Storylines tend to be very confused. There's a lot of flashbacks interspersing with narratives, interspersing with the main plot. If it was just a simple plot of Detective X finds out who killed this person and gets revenge on them, sort of like what you might see in, for instance, the Laura Bow games that I did LPs of before this, it wouldn't quite be noir. There's just this unreality, this sense of moving from the real world into a dreamlike state and confronting what you find there that is fairly unique to film noir. Additionally, it is a fierce struggle. Another element that's present in a lot of film noir is just ugliness. It confronts a lot of the downsides, the undersides of whatever society it happens to take place in. If it's an American film, it can be the downside of the American dream. People sacrificing home and family life, personal happiness in the quest for something greater, be it business success or something else like that. You can deal with criminal underworlds. I read a film noir novel set in Japan that even still was dealing with sort of this post-World War II feeling of hopelessness and alienation, along with the fairly degrading underworld that they have, especially for sex workers. And one thing that you might not get if you've just watched the old classic film noir movies, Humphrey Bogart and so forth, because they pretty much weren't allowed to show this, was there tends to be a fair amount of fairly brutal, shocking violence in film noir. They definitely don't shy away from ugly displays, whereas in more of a James Bond film, the femme fatale would be just sort of an action-packed heroine who's certainly capable of killing someone, but someone who's able to turn themselves around fairly quickly and, get with the hero with no real problems. The femme fatale in film noir is going to be more dangerously obsessed, broken, and lashing out viciously when she thinks she has an advantage. You're never sure that you can trust anyone in a film noir, and there is certainly no expectation, as Roger Ebert put it, of a happy ending. Now, that's not to say that there aren't common stylistic elements that happen to be part of film noir, and this is part of what I think is interesting. I think so many of the early film noir films were hard-boiled detective stories that some of that stuff has really embedded itself in the genre. I mean, if you're dealing with kind of a scruffy guy wearing a trench coat and it's raining and you're in a city street somewhere, you've got a fairly good idea that they're going after noir, and that's certainly the case with Blade Runner, set in the future, as well as Gemini Rue. Although notice there that in both of those, they deal very heavily with these dreamlike elements. You're not exactly sure what happens, even to the end of Blade Runner. There's a lot of leeway in the story. With Gemini Rue, trying to avoid spoilers as much as I can, there's a big part of the game where you're not sure if you're being watched, if you should be paranoid. Well, you should be paranoid for at least part of it, but you're not exactly sure what the motivations are, what the capabilities of the enemies are. You're fighting against your own mind, your own identity. And I think it's that which is just so interesting when it combines with these more or less straightforward whodunit kind of plots that can really draw you in. Just as an example, in a typical police procedural, which is, or even a hard-boiled detective novel, which is probably the closest analog you're going to get to some of the stylistic elements of film noir, it's unlikely that the main characters are going to go through much of a mental or emotional transformation. They may be hardened in some way or able to face up to some trauma they faced in the past as a result of, catching the baddie or whatever, but there's not going to be a tremendous amount of self-doubt. It's more about, as the name suggests, the actual procedure of hunting down and capturing the villain. And about the villain, there's typically not so much doubt either. Oh, they can have plot twists, we thought it was this person, but it was really somebody else. But those are actually secondary. I mean, they're all clearly presented in a narrative when it comes to hunting down and catching the criminal. Film noir is frequently more a vehicle for saying something about society and about the individual's relation to it, how you relate to your wants and desires, how things can get confused. And it's this sort of ability to talk about these deep, constantly important themes in humanity that keeps it a really interesting genre. And when we want to talk about neo-noir, there's plenty of that work being done today. The film historian that I talked to mentioned David Lynch, Quentin Tarantino, David Fincher, Christopher Nolan. All are working in what would be pretty easily classified into neo-noir. The new Batman films, for instance, would fit more or less neatly into neo-noir. Usual Suspects, Memento, Inception, all of these are good examples. She concluded by saying film noir is not just one thing, it's many things, and that's what makes it so interesting. As a mode, it continues to evolve to accommodate the storytelling needs of the culture at every moment, especially in terms of expressing our dark side, our personal and cultural anxieties, objectively and subjectively. I thought that was very well put. And you have to admit, if there is one thing that noir could perhaps be accused of, it's probably taking itself just a little bit too seriously. It gets very lost in this dark, brooding nature of man, who can ever know what's going on, and these high-contrast black and white pictures of rain in cities. And so that's why I think if you're going to lampshade something like film noir, the Discworld series is actually and sort of surprisingly perfect for it. Because it's hard to lampshade noir if you're not willing to both take yourself seriously and not seriously at the same time. Something which just had a detective doing wacky things wouldn't actually be a good mockery of it. Discworld and the sort of Terry Pratchett snarky but still sort of serious tone, I think, is just absolutely perfect for film noir. With Luton, we see somebody who really does embody an awful lot of film noir protagonist characteristics. He's bitter, he's certainly constantly questioning himself, he's comfortable in a state of uncertainty, he leads us through such a state, and he certainly doesn't have any force of authority behind him. He's lost in a foggy maze, as I think I said before. But through it all, there's just this slight thread, at times much more than slight, but at times just a slight thread of absurdity that I think really plays well. So, we'll be doing a lot of noir recommendations in the future, and hopefully more discussion about the genre as I get to understand more of it. But I hope you enjoyed this short intro, and I hope you can appreciate the genre a bit more as we move forward. Alright, thanks. See you for next update.